The goal of this video lecture is to review the psychodynamic approach to psychopathology, including the way that this approach conceptualizes mental illness, some of the key concepts that are important for understanding this approach, and the kinds of interventions that are guided by this approach. So the psychodynamic approach is grounded in the theories and concepts developed by Freud. And Freud's approach, and also these later adaptations of the psychodynamic approach, conceptualize behavior and emotions, including psychopathology, as resulting from unconscious mental processes. So unlike other approaches that emphasize either physiological processes, like a biological or a medical model, or mental processes that we might be aware of, such as a cognitive approach or a learning theory approach, from Freud's approach, the unconscious is really the driving force behind our behavior and emotions. So these unconscious processes, these needs or wishes or desires or anxiety or conflict, all kinds of things that are happening out of our conscious awareness in our mental life, are responsible for producing the behaviors and emotions that characterize psychopathology. Another important component of the psychodynamic approach is that it emphasizes the role of early childhood experiences. So according to Freud, early childhood experiences are very important because they set the stage for experiences later in life by influencing the structure of our consciousness and creating things in our unconscious. For example, unconscious conflicts or unconscious wishes are established through patterns of experience early in our childhood. And these patterns of experience that exist outside of our conscious awareness then influence our later experiences and emotions and behaviors. So even as the psychodynamic approach has moved away from some of Freud's original theories, the more modern psychodynamic approach does continue to emphasize the importance of early childhood experiences and the role of unconscious processes that happen outside of our conscious awareness. There are some key concepts that are important for understanding the psychodynamic approach. And one of the most important contributions that Freud made to the way that we think about experiences is what he had to say about the structure of consciousness. So one of the most important elements of Freud's approach that has been maintained in the modern psychodynamic approach is the idea that not everything that we experience happens within our conscious awareness. So you can think of this using the iceberg analogy. Our conscious awareness are the thoughts and feelings and behaviors that we are aware of. But underneath all of that, Freud says that we have a vast unconscious experience that we don't have conscious access to. This unconscious is largely shaped by our early experiences. And this is where we have unconscious instincts and needs and wishes and desires and traumas and conflict and fears and passions and all kinds of experiences that are happening outside of our conscious awareness. Freud also says that there are ways in which some of the contents of our unconscious can be brought into conscious awareness. And often this is through what's called preconscious states. So preconscious states include things like dreaming, where some things from the unconscious can come into awareness, perhaps in a symbolic form in a dream. It may come through things like a Freudian slip, where something that someone says out loud that is not what they meant to say accurately reflects some kind of unconscious thought that they were not aware of. And when we talk about interventions, we'll talk about what Freud had to say about ways in which deliberate practices, things like hypnosis or free association or psychoanalysis, could bring knowledge from the unconscious into conscious awareness. Another important concept for understanding the psychodynamic approach is Freud's concept of the structure of the psyche. So according to Freud, our behavior and experiences are largely guided by three different components of the self. The first component of the self, and the one that we are born with, we call the id. The id is guided by the pleasure principle. So the id wants to eat food that tastes good, it wants to touch things that feel good, it wants to satisfy its hedonistic desires. We are all born with an id. The next part of the self that develops is the ego. And the job of the ego is to deal with reality. So the ego is governed by the reality principle. And according to Freud, our ego actually develops over time as a result of patterns of interactions with our caregivers. So through our experiences with caregivers, we learn that we are a person who is separate from other people, we're separate from our caregivers and separate from the world. And we learn that we need to navigate the demands of reality and our perhaps competing demands from the id. So while the id is governed by the pleasure principle, it wants what it wants because it likes what it wants, the ego is governed by the reality principle, and the ego's job is to mediate between the other components of the self and the demands of the real world. And then the final component of the self, Freud calls the superego. The superego develops latest in childhood, typically around kind of the age of 6 or 7. You'll see the development of the superego. And the superego is guided by the morality principle. So the superego is the set of internalized social and moral rules that guide behavior. So one way that you can think about the id and the superego is that they're kind of like the angel and the devil on your shoulder. So the id is the devil on your shoulder who wants to skip class and take a nap and go eat brownies for breakfast. And the superego, which is governed by the morality principle, says you have to go to class, you should eat healthy food, you should have fruits and vegetables, and you have to do everything that you're supposed to. The ego is governed by the reality principle and mediates between the id and the superego, and also mediates with reality. So the id might say, you need to do your homework and you have to eat a good breakfast, but you could have Lucky Charms for breakfast if you have some milk on your cereal because milk is good for you. And once you have your homework done, you can go watch something on TV and take a break. So the ego is mediating between these conflicting demands from the id and the superego, and also taking reality into account. So this is an important contribution for understanding the psychodynamic approach, because sometimes psychopathology might result from overstrengthening of one element of the self, so perhaps an overactive id or an overly developed superego, or there might be unconscious conflict between different elements of the self. So for example, if there is intense conflict between the id and the superego that an individual is unaware of, that conflict in the unconscious could still produce behaviors and emotional experiences in consciousness that are distressing to the person. Another important set of concepts for understanding the psychodynamic approach are what are called defense mechanisms. So according to Freud, these are a set of things that our psyche does to manage experiences and anxiety and conflict that's occurring in the unconscious. So defense mechanisms are typically healthy adaptive mechanisms that help us manage anxiety and manage conflict, but sometimes defense mechanisms can lead to problems. So for example, overly active defense mechanisms or inappropriate defense mechanisms might contribute to someone developing symptoms. For example, when we talk about depressive disorders, we'll talk about how Freud saw depression as an example of a defense mechanism that was directed at an inappropriate target. So if you've ever heard the phrase that depression is anger turned inward, that is Freud's approach to thinking about depression that he called introjection. And introjection is a defense mechanism where if you have anger that you're going to direct at an inappropriate object, instead of directing that anger at the thing you're actually angry at, you introject the anger towards yourself. So Freud saw that defense mechanism as the defense mechanism that could lead to the development of depression. There are a wide variety of defense mechanisms, so these include things like denial and repression, projection, displacement, reaction formation. All of these are ways that the self and the mind can defend itself against inappropriate or unacceptable desires or conflicts or wishes or anger or anxiety or anything that might be going on in the unconscious that the self does not want to come into conscious awareness. And then a final important set of concepts for understanding the psychodynamic approach has to do with the stages of psychosexual development. So this is how Freud characterized normal development across the lifespan. He characterized development in a stage theory where people's focus of their development and what he called the libidinal energy is oriented around particular parts of the body at different phases of development. And this is important in terms of thinking about psychopathology, because when Freud thought about problems that occurred during particular stages of development, he related problems during those stages of development to specific later kinds of symptoms or problems that people could experience. So for example, problems during the oral stage of development might be related later to what he would consider an oral fixation, for example, someone who's addicted to smoking cigarettes. When we talk about obsessive compulsive spectrum disorders, we'll talk about how Freud thought about problems during the anal stage of development, contributing to obsessive compulsive traits, and what he would characterize as an anal retentive personality. So this stage theory really emphasizes important tasks of development that are kind of focused on different parts of the body. So in infancy, the primary task of the infant is to stay alive and be fed. So the primary erogenous zone during the oral stage of development, during that first year, is the mouth. That's where the baby gets its pleasure. Around the age of 2 to 3, Freud saw the most important task that children were doing as potty training. They're learning to control the world. They are asserting control over themselves and their bodies. So during this process of potty training, the primary erogenous zone is the anus. So this is the anal stage of development. The phallic stage of development occurs around the age of 3 to 5. Freud called this the phallic stage of development because he thought that this is when children go through an important experience that he called the Oedipal complex. So boys go through the Oedipal complex, and later Freud and other followers developed a parallel version for girls that was called the Electra complex. And this is very important because this is the process through which children develop a superego and develop that sense of the morality principle that guides their behavior. Freud also saw it as very important for helping encourage children to adopt a gender role that was consistent with their gender. So this is how girls came to identify with their mothers and want to grow up to be like their mothers, and how boys identified with their fathers and wanted to grow up to be like their fathers. So Freud saw that as really important. From about the ages of 6 to 11, Freud said that you go through a stage called the latency stage, where there are a lot of other important things that kids are learning. So they're going to school, they're learning to read, they're learning math, they're learning to socialize. So not a lot happening with the erogenous zones during this stage. And then at puberty, you enter the genital stage, where the primary erogenous zone is the genitals, and the individual experiences mature sexual interests. So the stages of psychosexual development are important in terms of understanding how Freud saw normal development as unfolding, and how Freud saw problems that could occur during these different stages of development as related to later symptoms and problems consistent with psychopathology. So all of our psychodynamic interventions are guided by the idea that addressing these unconscious problems and bringing them into conscious awareness is the means by which we can address people's symptoms. So if the problem is things that are occurring out of conscious awareness, the goal of the intervention is to bring that knowledge into consciousness so that it can be dealt with. There were a range of tools that Freud and later psychodynamic therapists used to bring this information into conscious awareness. Psychoanalysis is a form of therapy that was developed by Freud that uses a variety of approaches in order to encourage people to become aware and conscious of their unconscious experiences. So psychoanalysis might include techniques like free association and just having the person say whatever comes into their mind, and also interpreting dreams, so using dreams as a lens to study that information that's coming from the unconscious into the preconscious. The psychodynamic interventions also really emphasize how important the relationship between the therapist and the patient is, and they really see that relationship as a way that the patterns of interactions that a patient has with other important people in their life that are shaped by these unconscious processes is going to be acted out in their relationship with the therapist. So one important concept for understanding this is called transference. And transference is when a patient starts treating a therapist as though they are someone else important in the patient's life. So for example, if a therapist needs to cancel a therapy session because they get sick, they might have a patient call and feel really hurt and say, you're not taking care of me. I felt really hurt when you canceled the session. A psychodynamic therapist would be really interested in that as evidence of transference. So is there some kind of unconscious pattern related to not feeling cared for by important people, perhaps not feeling cared for by their parents in childhood? Countertransference is related, and countertransference has to do with how the therapist feels about the patient. Often countertransference can come from the therapist's own experiences and can also be driven by behaviors that the patient is engaging in. So for example, is a therapist feeling really frustrated with a patient, they might think about the kinds of behaviors that the patient is engaging in. Is the patient engaging in pretty frustrating behaviors? Are they testing boundaries? Are they acting out? That might be some evidence perhaps of some transference happening for the patient. Is the patient acting like a naughty child to see if they're going to get punished or to see if they're going to get away with it? So by interpreting and understanding this pattern of relationships and interactions between the therapist and the patient, the goal of psychodynamic therapy is to understand the unconscious patterns of experience and desires and wishes and needs and conflict and anxiety that are driving the patient's experience and to bring them into conscious awareness. So modern psychodynamic therapies might look different from traditional psychoanalysis, but are still going to be guided by those same important principles of the importance of unconscious processes and the importance of bringing unconscious processes into conscious awareness, and also the importance of the role of early childhood experiences and the need to address those, often through examining the relationship between the patient and their therapist.